All right, so moving on, continuing with Unit 2. Now we're going to move past the integument and talk about bone basics. So, again, we're not talking about individual bones so much, just kind of what makes up bones and what they're all about. So, let's talk about bone in general. Bone, sometimes you'll see it called osseous tissue, which seems really pretentious, but I guess it could be called that. It's this hard, protective substance. You're familiar with bone. It's made up of collagen fibers. Collagen fibers are the organic portion of this, and you can see proteoglycans and glycoproteins. Not so much concern there. Collagen fibers, these really tough connective tissue fibers, and woven in throughout those collagen fibers are calcium mineral salts that are hard, and they represent this really hard structure. And so that gives bone its characteristics. Bone also creates cavities for the body. And so, like a long bone, like your femur, your big leg bone, it has this big cavity in the middle of it. It's not a solid thing. And so, in the middle of it, there can be fat storage. This is where blood cell production is going to be happening. There are cells in the bone called osteocytes. You can see that word right there on your screen. An osteocyte is just a fancy word for bone cell. They reside in the middle of this matrix. And so bone is a living tissue. It's constantly changing. It is well supplied by blood vessels and nerves. If you've ever broken a bone, you're very familiar that they have nerves in them, because that is not a pleasant experience at all. And you're probably familiar with the fact that they have blood vessels, because there's a lot of bruising and stuff that goes on with that as well. There's going to be 5 types of cells that we're going to look at in the bone. And this has a couple of them. There's one other one that I'll mention here that goes along with this. The first one there are these osteoprogenitor cells. They're kind of like the beginning. You can think of them as almost like stem cells for bone. They are found in the outer and inner linings of the bone. We're going to give those words in a minute: periosteum and endosteum. And these linings and these cells are found there, and this is where bone comes from. It's where it's generated. From that, you can see that next is the osteoblast. And the osteoblast, its role is to build new bone tissue. It secretes that matrix that the bone is made out of, particularly the collagen fibers, the organic portion of that. And they are responsible for growing more bone. And they will mature to become the osteocyte, which is a mature bone cell. They're going to be inside these little spaces called lacunae, and they maintain the bone matrix. You'll see that lacunae in a second, so don't worry about that. But they maintain the bone. They keep it going. And so all throughout the bone, there are these cells, but most of the bone is just this inorganic material. And then there's osteoclasts. Osteoclasts are the opposite of osteoblasts. They're absorbing bone. They're kind of like cleaning up, recycling, that sort of thing. They're these really big cells. They have more than one nucleus, as you can see there. The picture's doing a good job showing you this. We're going to talk about things called phagocytes and macrophages, and this is kind of like the bones version of that. And one more cell that's not on this list are called bone lining cells. And the bone lining cells, think about they're found on the surfaces of the bones, and when the bones are not remodeling, when they're not moving things around, then these bone lining cells are there and they're maintaining things. And so they're kind of like maintenance type cells. The osteon, it's a unit of compact bone. And so this shows you here a bone. And this osteon is this one single pillar. And you can see that this bone is made of lots of these little pillars. So if you want to think about bone, like if you grabbed a handful of pencils and held them together, that's a really solid structure. It's because the that structure is the combined strength of each one of those pencils. It's actually be stronger than a solid rod of the same thickness because of that combined tensile strength. And so you can almost think of this as these bunches of pillars that combine together to carry weight. And each one of these osteons is composed of these concentric rings. Think of like a tree, growth rings in a tree. Each one of these rings is called a lamella, these layers, and these little lacunae, which I mentioned earlier, that's these little holes, and that's where the bone, the osteocytes will sit. And in the middle of this osteon is something called a haversian canal, or I'll probably just say central canal. And the central canal is where blood vessels are going to be, where nerves are going to be. And you can kind of see here, there's other tunnels that are being made too. But I mean, if every one of these osteons has blood vessels in it, the bone is well supplied with oxygen, with blood and nerve endings and all this sort of thing. So the bone is a living and active kind of tissue. So some more anatomy terms just for bones. There's compact bone. Compact bone is the hard bone around the surface, and then on the inside you have spongy bone. It's called spongy bone because it looks like a sponge, but it's not spongy in that, if you push on it, it's spongy. It's actually more like a honeycomb. Think of like a stiff honeycomb that has a lot of holes, and so you can put things in those holes. So you have a nice little blood vessel running through here, or some marrow will be up in that spongy bone as well. We'll get to marrow in a minute. The shaft of the bone is called the diaphysis, and the ends of the bone are called the epiphysis. Here you have the proximal and distal epiphysis, and on the epiphyses, you're going to have these lines right here, which you have probably heard called growth plates, but you will also see them called epiphyseal plates. And this is where new bone is being made. As when you are born, this epiphyseal plate is all cartilage. And as you age, that cartilage is going to get less and less. The cartilage is representing the new bone being made. And then at some point in your development, those growth lines or those epiphyseal plates will actually turn completely to bone. And the doctor can look at your growth plates and say, yeah, you're still growing or whatever. Well, that's where they get that from. It's not magic. All right. Around the bone is something called the periosteum. You can see that here. You can see it being peeled back here. Periosteum is this tough outer covering. It covers the entire bone except near the ends of the bone, and it's richly supplied with blood vessels and nerves again. Then there's on the inside, you have the endosteum, which is just think of the covering for the inside of that. You have red marrow and yellow marrow. I don't have a good picture of red marrow here. Sometimes you will see it called hematopoietic tissue, which, for our purposes, we're not worried about that. That hematopoietic is just a red blood cell type of thing, because that red marrow is where blood cells are produced, and the yellow marrow, which as you age, your yellow marrow fills more and more space and the red marrow less and less, which makes sense. And that yellow marrow, its main purpose is to store fat, and it also has mesenchymal cells. Remember mesenchymal cells from when we talked about connective tissue, and those mesenchymal cells are basically like your stem cells for the bone. Moving on to cartilage. There are lots of kinds of cartilage, actually lots as in 3. Cartilage is a tough connective tissue. It resists compression, but yet retains shape. And so it has a lot of flexibility, which serves its purposes well. There are 3 kinds of them. Now, cartilage is interesting. If you've ever damaged cartilage, you know that it takes a long time to heal. The reason is because there's really no blood vessels in it. There is a covering around it that has blood vessels in it, but the cartilage itself doesn't have a lot of blood. So it takes a while for cartilage to heal. That while is longer the older you are. 3 kinds of cartilage. There's hyaline cartilage. You can see them right here for the spellings. Hyaline cartilage is when you think of cartilage, this is what you're thinking about. This provides support, flexibility. This is located at the joints. You can see every joint here has this blue hyaline cartilage. The costal cartilages, which connect the ribs to the sternum here. So if you touch your breastbone and like those surrounding areas are just cartilage. So it does have some real structure and rigidity to it. Respiratory areas, and so like your trachea, that your windpipe in the front of your neck. If you feel of that, it's hard because that cartilage is surrounding it. That's good, right? It protects that from being damaged. And even your bronchi into your lungs, they have this same cartilage in them. Keeps them nice and open, keeps them protected. It's a good thing. And then lastly, of course, your nose has that hyaline cartilage. And then the lesser known cartilage, first one is the elastic cartilage. Elastic cartilage is different in that it has a lot more stretchy fibers in it. And so this allows it to have more repeated bending and still come back to normal form. Ears are the most famous of the elastic cartilage, but last but not least is the epiglottis. This is the thing that covers your esophagus or covers your trachea when you swallow, so that food doesn't get down there. And when the epiglottis is sleeping on the job, that's when you choke. And lastly is the fibrocartilages, and these cartilages are good at high tensile strength, and so they can take a whole lot of torsion and a whole lot of impact. And these are found in the vertebral discs in the knees. So like if you've ever had a torn meniscus, that's your fibrocartilage that's been torn. And then the pubic symphysis, which is where your hip bones join. There's a lot of pressure there. And so that fibrocartilage is able to take all of that pressure.